Hello, welcome back to the David Watson podcast. And today I had a chance to speak with Terry Tucker, who, one of the reasons I contacted him, he had the most amazing tagline. But I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm going to let him explain who he is. Incredibly energetic, exciting guy. And I hope you enjoy the episode as much as I enjoyed talking to him. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. How are you?
Hey, David, how are you? I am really good. I'm looking forward to talking with you today.
So you and I have actually just had a really interesting conversation, but I just always like to do the introduction and ask everyone how they are. And we somehow we were talking about difficult decisions and how they need to be made. And as a former hostage negotiator, you made two very important points. I don't often know why I'm there, but I definitely know you're having a bad day. And there's loads of armed police outside. And the first thing that come into my head as well, because there's those two things that, like, yeah, damn, you know, that's a hell of a way to wake up in the morning. Oh, by the way, could you just pop off down here? Because the other thing that occurred to me as well, which is kind of reflective of what you and I were talking about, is everybody is looking at you expecting you to know the answer. And give people some background, we were literally just talking about the fact that often we don't know what the outcome is going to be until we've asked a question.
Yeah, it's all about communicating, and you know, like you said, if you're talking to me and your house is surrounded by the police, you're probably having one of the worst days, if not the worst day of your life. So I'm supposed to figure out a solution, a good solution that gets you out or gets the hostages out safely, with the understanding that, one, I've never met you, and two, I a lot of times have no idea why we're here. What precipitated you taking a gun and barricading yourself or taking hostages at this point in time? What got you to this point? And I don't know. So we would start out with what we used to call tactical empathy. I think you can get rid of the word tactical and just talk about empathy. So literally the conversation would be something like, hey, David, I'm Terry. Help me to understand what's going on today. And the important word there is understand, not necessarily agree. I mean, if you were a homicide suspect that just murdered 3 people, I wasn't going to say, oh yeah, I totally understand why you did that. Okay. But understanding breeds trust, and trust gets me to a point where hopefully I can get you out safely.
Because how reflective are films of negotiations?
They're not.
Yeah.
No. I mean, there was back in the, I think, late 1990s, there was a film called The Negotiator. It was with Samuel L. Jackson, you know, big Hollywood star, that basically portrayed him as a Superman. You know, he did everything. And the way it really works is, yes, there is a primary person talking to the individual, but there's also another negotiator sitting right next to you, listening to everything that's going on. And then there are probably 3, 4, 5 more negotiators doing what I used to call working the crowd. Help me figure out why we're here. What precipitated this? Talk to people. And so you may be talking to this individual and you'll get a note from the secondary sitting next to you that says, don't talk about his mother. Because the people working the crowd found out he had a huge fight with his mother. He grabbed a gun and he barricaded himself in his room. Okay, good. That's good information to know. So it was more of a team effort than it was an individual effort.
How often, like, I'm always curious with things about, so as I was talking to you earlier, I was talking about the fact I do a lot of head injury rehabilitation. And back in the earlier days, I used to deal with a lot of young male adults who had behavioural problems. And one of the things that I found was key was just to learn what their trigger points were. And then literally negotiate avoiding them. Not challenge them, but just like if you knew certain things triggered them, find strategies that avoid those things, not learn coping mechanism for when they help. Because in my experience, it never helped. But if you actually learn how to navigate so it didn't come up too often, it would, I would say, had a 100% success rate. Were there like patterns to how these things happen? Because I imagine that nobody sort of gets up in the morning and thinks, I'm going to take people hostage. I imagine it's like an escalation of events that become a desperate act, like a last act of just... Because the weird thing is, what did you think the outcome was going to be? But they're already in the situation now, so it's too late.
Right. And the answer to your question is yes and no. And I'll explain what I mean. So when I first started as a hostage negotiator, I remember we were given a formula. And that formula was how we as human beings communicate with each other. And the formula was 7-38-55. So 7% of how we communicate a message with each other are the words that we use. Yeah. And think how many times in your life you've been like, oh, I wish I would have said that differently, or I wish I hadn't said that at all. That's only 7% of how that message comes across. 38% is the tone of voice that you use with that message. Are you excited and things are really going on? Are you down and depressed? Are you kind of middle of the road? Whatever that is. So 38% is your tone of voice. And then 55%, so more than half of how a message gets communicated, is our body language and our facial expressions. And the reason they gave us that formula was, as negotiators, like we were talking, if somebody had a gun and was barricaded in a room, I was not in the room with them trying to get them to put the gun down. I was many times blocks away or even on the outside of the door. So we didn't have that 55%. We didn't have the luxury of saying something and see the person kind of roll their eyes like, oh, what an idiot. I can't believe he said that to me. So we had to get good at figuring things out, certainly based on what people were saying, but also what they weren't saying and how they were saying it. And you're right, there are a lot of trigger points that we didn't, it's kind of like trying to negotiate a minefield. We didn't know where those trigger points were, but if we hit them, it was, we certainly didn't gloss over them. We would just acknowledge them. Yeah. It's like, you seem like you're really upset with your mother. And the last thing I'll say about this is this. The reason hostage negotiation was so exhausting is because you had to get down in the weeds with these people. So if somebody was ranting and raving and yelling and screaming about their mother, for example, and you said something like, oh, you seem like you're a little upset with your mother. No, you totally missed it. You got to be like, you're pissed as hell at your mother, aren't you? Yes. Because again, that's, oh, Terry gets me. He understands where I'm coming from. We're, again, building that understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to people about this all the time. So I'm a hypnotherapist as well, and I often say to people, like when I'm coaching and stuff, that when you're listening to people, if you really listen, and I don't know how to describe how to do the listening, just that if you're really listening to somebody, often it's what they don't say that stands out. And it's just, but you can't mention that to them. You kind of have to go down a little road first and then come back to what you think they've missed. And if you get that timing right, they'll tell you a whole story about something that they didn't want to talk about or didn't realize was bothering them. But it's that,
you're absolutely right.
The silence. It's like, and I describe to people sometimes that sometimes somebody will say something and it's just like, no, that's a wrong order to say it. It's just, and I don't know how to say it, but it's like an elephant is in the sentence, and it's just like, that's not right. But I don't know what it is. I just know I have to come back to it at some point.
Exactly, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you can't, if you don't know what you're talking about, if you don't know what the reason is, if you don't, you just kind of have to pick a rabbit hole and go down it. Yeah. And like I said, if you're wrong, I mean, and there were a lot of times we would think, I think this person wants to kill themselves. I think this person wants to commit suicide. And so we would flat out ask them. It's like, hey, David, are you thinking about harming yourself or killing yourself? And if they were not thinking like that, they would fire right back at you. No, you dummy, I'm not thinking about killing myself. But if they were, just like you said, you just opened a door for them that may allow them to kind of burn off that emotional energy by, oh, yeah, Terry sees me. I'm seen as a human being. Let me describe to you, Terry, what my problem is. Great. That's what I'm looking for. And one way we used to do this is we would use how and what questions. We would stay away from why questions, because why questions sound accusatory. You know, if I said, hey, David, why did you wear that shirt today? Oh, wait a minute. Does Terry not like the shirt I'm wearing, or does he not feel I should have worn? I can get to the same answer by saying, David, what made you decide to wear that shirt today? That's much less intrusive, but gets me to the same answer that I'm looking for.
You said, used a really interesting phrase there about burning off the energy. How much of the kind of the hostage, just communication with a hostage, is just giving them like an almost an unlimited time to just talk themselves down?
You hit the nail kind of right on the head. I mean, we used to describe what we did kind of as, think about when we were little and we would go to the park and we would play on the teeter-totter or the seesaw. Yeah. When we started negotiating with somebody, usually they were ranting and raving, yelling and screaming. Their emotional brain was in control. Their emotional brain was way up in the air. Their rational brain was down on the ground. By letting them burn off a lot of this emotional energy, by asking them how and what questions, you kind of bring that teeter-totter to equilibrium. And then by continuing to let them burn off that energy and asking them questions, and, and identifying, building that trust, you get to the point where their rational brain is up in the air and their emotional brain is down on the ground. And you're right, that may take hours, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. And that's when you can start talking about solutions, putting the gun down, letting the hostages go, coming out. When they're yelling and screaming, ranting and raving, you are not talking about solutions because their emotional brain's in control. We all know we make better decisions for ourselves with our rational brain instead of our emotional brain. So yeah, we had to get them to burn off a lot of that emotional energy. And the last thing I'll say about this is this particular point. We never lied to people. People would say to us, well, I'll put the gun down and I'll come out, but you got to promise me I'm not going to go to jail. And we would have to say, well, when you come out, you are going to go to jail, and then we would try to deflect the conversation to something that was more palatable. And the reason we never lied to people, and this happened several times, is that a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, let's say the reason they took a gun and barricaded themselves was they had a big fight with their mother. Well, mom's still around. Mom's still pushing their buttons. So 3 years from now, they have another big blow up with mom and they barricade themselves with a gun again. And if they ever felt we lied to them in any way, then that trust factor was out the window and we were going to have to bring in another negotiator to start from scratch, from ground zero, and start all over again.
It's interesting. Because as you can imagine, I've never had the opportunity to speak to somebody that's negotiated with hostages. And I'm trying to get a kind of a sense of why somebody would do it. But it's easy for me as a rational person to say, I can't imagine it ever happening to me.
Yeah. I mean, it was... and I'm going to use words that are going to sound really bad. It was fun. It was, it really, you had to get engaged with these people and you wanted to help. And David, 90% of the time we got people out safely. We got either the hostages out or the bad guy out safely. But about 10% of the time, for example, if we were negotiating with somebody, like I said, that was a homicide suspect that had murdered somebody, they knew they were caught. They knew they weren't going to get out of this situation, and they knew they were going to spend the rest of their life in prison. They usually opted to put a bullet in their head, to ending their life. It's like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this. And while we tried to keep the power, and a lot of times we would, for example, somebody would say, I want this. And my response would be, well, David, how am I supposed to do that? What I just did there was lob the ball back into your court and get you to start thinking how you can help me to get you out safely. You didn't realize that, but it's like, how am I supposed to do this? And so a lot of times with those people that knew they were going to spend the rest of their life in prison, they opted to end their life. And while that was always tragic, don't get me wrong, any loss of life is bad. I never, and I don't mean to sound callous about this, but I never lost any sleep over it. No. Because I knew I worked with good people. I knew I had good training. And I knew I did everything I could to get those people out safely.
Because no, I do understand that, because that comes back to what you and I were saying before I started recording. When you're in positions that you just have to have difficult conversations with people, there isn't an easy answer and there isn't an easy outcome. The conversation has to be had there and then. Then that the end of it. There's like no pun intended, but there's no negotiating when you can have a conversation. If it has to be had, it has to be had. But so where was, like, let's go back a lot further. What was childhood? Where were you born? What was, like mum, dad, all of that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, one of the larger cities here in the United States. I'm the oldest of 3 boys. I'm 6'8" tall, and I went to college on a basketball scholarship. I've got another brother who's 6'7", who was a pitcher for the University of Notre Dame here in the U.S., and another brother who's 6'6", who was drafted in the National Basketball Association, professional basketball. And then my dad was 6'5". So we used to joke that if you sat behind our family in church growing up, not a prayer's chance you were going to see anything that was going on, at the front of the church. But our 5'8" mother was really the boss. It didn't matter how big, tall, strong we were. Whatever mom said, that's the way it went. And I know, our parents taught my brothers and I have no sisters, the importance of family, of loving each other, of caring for each other, of supporting each other, and of service to other people. Both of my brothers are in high school education here in the United States, and I was in law enforcement. So I think mom and dad never said that, you should be of service, but they modeled it. We watched them do it. And I think that's expressed in how my brothers and I have gravitated towards certain jobs that are really of service to other people.
So after, I don't know, the brother that's 6'6", is he the youngest?
No, my brother is 6'7", is the youngest, who was a pitcher for Notre Dame.
Okay, it's just because I imagined you all going down in age and height, and just how even though there's like 6'6", you'd all mock each other because the youngest and shortest.
Yeah. My middle brother and I are 13 months apart. So, we're kind of Irish twins, so to speak. We kind of grew up together. My youngest brother's 6 years younger than I am.
Okay. Yeah. That I can just imagine a 5'8" mum and just, do you know what I mean? And just like, and ruling the roost. Just. Oh yeah.
She had to. She was always at the store buying milk and meat, and we were constantly. We all played sports. Football, American football, baseball, and basketball were things we grew up on. We were all, whatever season it was sports, and that was our whole family dynamic. Somebody had a game. My parents used to do what I call divide and conquer parenting, where it was, I'd have a game at 5:00 on Thursday night at this location, and my brother would have a practice at 5:00 on Thursday night at another location. So dad's going with me, mom's going with my brother. We were always running in a million different directions.
No, it's amazing when you listen to it because you can't see it, but your face lights up. So there's a lot of sort of just like the best memories. It's clear, we're just fantastic.
Oh, it was. My brothers came to visit me. I live in Colorado, a different state than they do, last summer. And we spent 3 days, never turned on the television, never left the house. We just told stories, laughed, and lied to each other. You remember when this happened? Oh, that didn't happen that way. It happened this way. And we just had a blast. It was great.
So after university, what did you do then?
My first job out of college was in the corporate headquarters of Wendy's International, the hamburger chain, in their marketing department. That was the good news. The bad news was I lived at home for the next 3.5 years as I helped my mother care for my father and my grandmother, who were both dying of different forms of cancer. And then after that, I actually went to work for the hospital that cared for my father and grandmother. I thought they did such a great job that I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to be part of that organization. So my first 2 jobs were in business. And then at 37, I made that major pivot and became a police officer.
At 37, you became a police officer?
I was old.
Yeah. No, but that is, it must have been a bit, I can just, again, I kind of had this like Hollywood idea of like a 6'8" man turning up, and someone said, "What? This is the rookie."
Yeah, I didn't get tried very much. I mean, I was tall. I was in good shape. It's like, really, you want to fight me? You're going to lose.
Yeah.
And so I didn't get tried very much. I had a female partner that was out of my academy class, and she was a black belt in karate, had a master's degree. And her dad used to always say, "Hey, when the shooting starts, make sure you hide behind Terry because he'll be able to, and stuff like that." So just a great relationship in that regard.
And how long were you doing that for? And sort of where did it die? Sort of what part?
Law enforcement. I did that for about 10 years. My wife has always been the primary breadwinner in our family, and she lost her job. We were in Cincinnati, Ohio, and another state in the U.S., and we ended up moving to Texas. And so I had to get out of law enforcement. And since I'd been on SWAT and I had all this training, I started a school security consulting business and worked with schools to sort of tighten things up and write their policies and procedures and train their staff.
Okay. What was an eye-opener about that? Let's start with a different way. What did schools do well? Not much.
Not a lot. Not a lot. There were a lot of open spaces, and I'm not one of these people that thinks the sky is falling. I mean, schools traditionally for young people are very safe places. I mean, you hear about school shootings and things like that, especially here in the U.S., but they're very rare given the tens of thousands of schools that are out there, either primary or secondary. So schools are a very safe place. And I'll give you just kind of a funny story. There's legislative mandates that schools have X number of fire drills every school year. David, nobody's died in a fire in a school in like 90 years.
Yeah.
But we're having drills, for all the time. And yet you do have these unfortunate school shooting events, and nobody's practicing. Nobody's understanding what to do. And from a law enforcement point of view, if you're ever involved in a critical incident, if you ever have to shoot, what happens to your body? You get tunnel vision. You're hearing, you don't hear things. Your fine motor skills go down the drain. That's why we practice drawing so many times, because it has to be muscle memory. It can't be you relying on, on your cognitive ability, because it's gone. You don't have that. Well, we practice that stuff in law enforcement. Kids don't practice that. Teachers don't practice that. Administrators don't practice that. So when one of these events occurs, most of them just freeze. It's like, I don't know what to do. I'm so paralyzed. I don't know what to do. And frozen people become very, very easy targets for people. So you got to prepare these people, not in a way that scares the heck out of them, but just that you're aware that if this happens, here's what you need to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think one of the biggest issues that America has with the school shootings is just how political it's become, as opposed to how do we potentially solve a problem. Because, like I said, I try to remain open-minded about these things, because the UK, you're not allowed a gun. It's just end of the story. If you legalise guns tomorrow, I'll be in the queue. Don't you worry about that. I've got no issue with guns, but I'm certainly not going to let my neighbour have a gun if I don't have one.
Right.
And I understand how tribal and childish that sounds, but I'm also being honest with myself, because I know people and I know what people will do. But I also, you hear things, like I said, and it's very difficult to find out truths when things are very political, but you always hear things. I remember listening to a gentleman who talked about when he was a kid, and he was like in the 70s. He said, we used to have things like rifle clubs and gun clubs at school where everybody was taught gun safety. He said, nobody ever tried to come to our school to shoot anybody, because half the kids had their guns, because we had gun club in the afternoon, where there would literally be a teacher who took on the responsibility of training youngsters how to handle guns safely, what to do, what not to. And he said, and when we scrap that, you sort of run into problems. But again, that's probably an simplistic, nostalgic view. But there might be a grain of truth in what he's saying.
I mean, there are more guns in the United States than there are adults.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a ton of guns out there. But your friend who you interviewed was right. I mean, my brother-in-laws used to drive to school in their pickup trucks with their shotguns, on the rack back there, go to school. And then when school was out, they'd go hunting after school. Nobody was shooting up schools in the 70s and in the 60s. It's more, I think, personally, it's more of a mental illness situation. And then those mentally ill people get access to guns.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can legislate, we've got laws that say, if you're domestic violence, all your guns get confiscated, and things like that. It really, I think, comes down to, if you have a mental illness, I need to know that. I need to know that as the parent. I need to know that.
But we've just had this thing, I think it was passed yesterday. They've just banned, in the UK, banned zombie knives and some other type of knife. And serrated machetes. Because I don't know if it's still correct, the UK has the highest knife crime in the world. Right? We've outlawed guns, so they've been doing this for years. They ban certain knives. Okay, knives are not the problem.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? It doesn't matter how many knives you make illegal. Somebody will just go and sharpen a butter knife. What are you going to do? You're
going to ban all cutlery?
It's not, the problem is a really simple one. It's just, if anybody without, because I used to, for a few years with my brother, I was a tree surgeon. We used to carry all sorts of knives because it was almost a tool for every job. And, but in theory, if I'd forgotten to unbelt one of my serrated blades and leave it in the truck and walked into Tesco's, which is a big supermarket chain in the UK, I could have been arrested. But actually, I was just somebody at work who'd forgotten to leave his tool because it was attached to his work belt. But you're just like, okay, you've banned these these weapons, and I try and explain this to people, to give some sort of context. Back when I was in my 20s, I got into trouble with the police, and I nearly went to prison. I ended up with community service, and I try and explain to people, right? And you will know this from prisons and people that do community service. Governments legislate in a way that acts like we don't know what the law is. And I say to people, the law applies to 99% of society, because the other 1%, people like me, we knew what the law was. We didn't care. We were going to do what we wanted to do. On the basis of, well, if I get caught, these are the consequences. I didn't plan on getting caught. You know what I mean? It's just,
and but that's You make a great point. You knew the consequences. Yeah. For example, I told you I grew up in Chicago. Chicago has one of the most stringent gun laws city.
I wasn't going to mention that, but I knew that.
Yeah, in the United States, and yet every weekend 100 people get shot. And it's like, it's not the good guys, it's the bad guys. And you're right, they don't care. They don't care what the law is. I'm going to get a gun. Okay. So why shouldn't I, a good guy, be able to defend myself against a bad guy?
But and this, and I see this type of legislation in every country around the world.
Yeah.
Bad people do bad things. Okay.
Yep.
Legislate against bad people. Don't put legislation in to like drink driving. It's been illegal in the United Kingdom for 40, 50 years. You can't drink drive. Everybody knows this. Right. Every year people still get banned for drink driving.
Yeah.
Right. We have one of the strictest laws in the world on drink driving. Anybody can be pulled over and breathalyzed at any time. You can't refuse them. If you can refuse a breathalyzer, but you end up in court and get charged with refusing to give a roadside sample. And
lose your license.
Right? Doesn't stop people refusing. It doesn't stop people from drink driving, blowing into it, knowing full well, oh yeah, I'm nicked because I've had 10 pints. It doesn't stop any of that.
No. I mean, it's just like in the United States, you probably have 40,000 people that get shot every year. Not killed, but, shot every year. You have about the same amount of people that are killed in automobile accidents every year. We're not banning cars. No. It's like, oh my God, 40,000 people died in car accidents. Let's get rid of cars. We're not saying that, but yet we're saying we got to get rid of guns. I'm like, I don't quite get the correlation here
No,
Oh, well, we need cars. We don't need guns. Really?
Yeah, I don't. And like I said, is the other thing as well that always, when I look at the history of America, is it your First Amendment right to carry guns? Second Amendment. My apologies. And this is going to sound very strange, but one of the reasons I can't, like I said, it's weird from somebody from the UK that has no skin in this game at all, is I think if it ever gets changed, people don't realise the impact it will have on your culture. Because it's when you start altering history, you lose who you are. Well,
and we're doing a great job of that right now, altering history. We're taking down statues because, those people were bad. And, and it's like, I'm not saying they were good. But is that really gonna solve the problem? I mean, the Second Amendment was put in by our founding fathers to make sure that the government was never able to be in a position, kind of like the Nazis. What's the first thing the Nazis did? They took away everybody's guns.
Exactly. It took away everyone's guns and tried to eradicate people's history.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's like, no, that's why it's important. I mean, our founding fathers thought it was important enough to put it in our Constitution and make it a right. Not something, I think you can have it. No, it's a right. It's a fundamental right. And people argue, well, that's not what they meant. I'm sorry, were you back there in 1776?
No, that's definitely what they meant.
It's exactly what they meant. Yeah.
As a British person who understands that the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms was actually due to the wars against the British government, where obviously America, for some crazy reason, decided not to be ruled correctly, and wanted to make their own independent decisions. Everybody wants independence, don't they? And
yes, they do.
But that is the fundamental reason it came about, is because of tyrannical oppression. And in this case, the tyranny, allegedly, was from the United Kingdom, right? I'm sure it's just a miscommunication. If they'd had better negotiators, it would have all been sorted out, right? But, and that is the fundamental principle behind it, that there can be no tyrannical oppression if you can defend yourself. And this idea, that's not what they meant. No, that's what they meant, because they were facing down the barrels of the British and the French as well, I think, actually, to be fair, and that's because that was the way it was. That was the time. And this idea that we're going to extrapolate what they meant in today's world and say, that's not what they meant. No. Yeah. No, it literally was, because if it hadn't been the British, if it hadn't been the French, it would have been somebody that, like people misunderstand. Like, it's funny, isn't it? Because one of the most famous things about the kind of the cowboy stories and the myth and the legend is their ability to just hang you from a tree. Mm-hmm. So that idea that they didn't mean you could bear arms because of that. No, that's literally how it meant. That's what it meant, because people could come along and string you up. So you had the right to defend yourself, because sometimes it was a corrupt government. Sometimes it might be a monarchy that didn't think you were paying enough taxes, and
exactly. And but again, we go back to the 60s, the 50s, the 70s. Everybody had guns, and nobody was shooting up schools or hospitals or anything else. So what has changed? Mental illness in this, especially in the United States. I can't speak to Great Britain, or the UK. I don't know if that's the case, but it's the case here. And the Supreme Court here has also said you cannot institutionalize these people. You've got to let them out. And so you've got all these people. Look at the homeless population here in the United States. So many of those people are either mentally ill or addicted to drugs or alcohol.
Yeah. No, I swear to you, I sometimes look at how closely. I mean, the United States and Great Britain always had an interest in kind of side-by-side relationship, right? And for the most part, it's always been positive.
Yes.
But the kind of mental illness analogy is, it's a direct reflection in the UK, and it's what's the most concerning, most worrying, from my perspective, is it's coming from the top.
It is. I mean, I used to always say that you would not need nearly as many police officers or law enforcement if you didn't have mental illness or addiction. You know, those are, I mean, I think of the runs that I used to take. You know, I was dispatched on a radio run. 90% of the time, alcohol or drugs were involved in some way. Person was drunk, or, you know, they made terrible decisions when they were drunk, whatever. Or they were mentally ill, and the family's like, I just can't deal with it. Call the police. Well, then you call the police, and the guy pulls a knife on you, and you shoot him. It's the cop's fault. You called me. Yeah. You couldn't, you know, deal with your loved one. So now you call me to do it, and then when you don't like the way I handle it, now I'm in trouble. It's like, no, I'm sorry. Nobody, in all the years I was in law enforcement, nobody I knew ever went out and said, I think I'm going to shoot somebody tonight. Shooting somebody and killing them especially lives with you for the rest of your life. It is a horrible, I've seen people do it. I've been there when people have shot and killed people. It's terrible. It messes them up for the rest of their life.
And yeah, I think that's something that's really important as well, is that people don't quite grasp that just because you saw something on social media, it doesn't mean it's a reflection of everybody in the same role.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I learned that. I remember when I was a sergeant, I came home. I was working the night shift. I came home. My wife had the news on. She was getting ready for work with our daughter. And she's like, that was your district, right? You were there, were you? I said, yeah, I was there. And I started watching it. I'm like, that didn't happen. The way that it was being reported, it's like, that didn't happen. It happened this way. But hey, if it bleeds, it leads. It's exciting. So we're going to sort of switch the facts a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's probably actually the one of the fundamental causes of mental illness. It's just the way the media portrays the world with zero accountability.
I've always said, you know, the media, there's the far left and there's the far right. 90% of America, at least, I think, is in the middle. 100%. They're good, kind, caring, decent human beings that just want the best for their family and their communities. It's the fringe that gets all the media coverage.
Yeah. And I think one of the worst situations we're in now is it's amazing how many times I have this conversation. You can actually be quite liberal, but if you just agree with something from someone, oh, you're far right then. There's nothing far right about me at all. If anything, I would consider myself liberal. I'm a liberal conservative, you know. I kind of, you know, mainly believe that most people, if you're not hurting anybody, you should have the right to do what you want. Outside of that, whatever you're doing is probably none of my business. I'm not sure how much more liberal it can get, but at the same time, I do believe that if you have an impact on your community that's negative, and there's a pattern that this is becoming a habit, well, then the community's just better off without you being there. And I don't think you really need to rehabilitate people in prison. I just really think you should just keep them out of a community. And if that means locking them up for 10 years, so be it. You know, it's just, you know what I mean? To keep communities safe, keep them clean, predominantly by minding your own business and telling other people to mind their own business. If somebody's not doing something that impacts you or hurts you.
I would agree with you. And I would probably say I'm on the other side of the spectrum. I'm probably more conservative than you are, but I totally agree with everything you say. If you want to go out, you know, and wear a diaper and howl at the moon, go ahead and do it. I don't care. It doesn't bother me in the least. But I think where we've sort of gotten off the rails is that it used to be, you're a liberal, I'm a conservative. We could have a relationship. We could be friends. We may not agree on everything, but we could be friends. But somehow now, if you don't agree with everything I say or everything I believe, you're wrong. You're bad in some way. It's like, when did that happen? Why?
That's, you know, something you just said that really important, because once upon a time, you could be liberal, I could be conservative. And in the moment that you're liberal and I'm conservative, there's still going to be, it's your round, buy the beers. And that's all there is to it, you know. There was nothing else. It was just, yeah, you're liberal, I'm conservative. Anyway, drink up. It's your round next. Get the beers in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our daughter's godmother is incredibly liberal, but my wife and her are incredibly good friends too. Yeah. You know, you're not a bad person. But at least in America, we've gotten to a point where if you don't agree with 100% of everything I feel, then you're a bad person. I don't have anything to do with you. It's like, no, we're human beings. We all have different experiences, different perspectives on life. That doesn't make us bad just because we don't agree with you. We can still have a relationship and still be friends. That part's got to change.
The UK is like that.
Is it? Okay.
I remember in the early days of sort of doing the podcast, and I was always kind of reaching out to people, and I remember having this conversation. Because sometimes people like to have can we have a conversation first to find out what your podcast is about? And my podcast is just, I'll talk to anyone that wants to have a conversation. I don't mind what you want to talk about, really. But when she found out that I voted for Brexit, effectively I never heard from her again. And the thing is and the weird thing is she kind of was like I think did mental health advocacy and like gardens, and you know what I mean, incredibly interesting person who probably had a really good insight into mental health and how gardening and projects such as that could help. And it was a real great opportunity to educate, but she never said it. I just know because after that conversation she never spoke to me again, never replied to another email, and it's like, oh, right, okay.
Yeah, I mean, but think about when we started talking about negotiation. What was the first thing that I said we would do? We would use empathy.
Yeah.
In other words, help me to understand. Again, understand, not necessarily agree with you, but by understanding, I can understand where you're coming from, why you might feel this way. Again, you may never bring me over to your side to agree with you, but that doesn't mean we can't have a relationship. We can't be friends. We can't be colleagues at work, whatever that is. We're human beings. We're better together than we are separately.
100%.
But somehow I think since COVID, all these people are, if you don't agree with me, I don't have anything to do with you people. Okay, you want to be by yourself, knock yourself out. But I don't think that's a great way to live.
Yeah, we had ours first in the sense that we had it with Brexit. Brexit was a massive divider in the UK. It was hugely divided, and still is. And then COVID came along, and I think our Brexit was similar to Trump's first presidential win. You were either like, yep, that's for me, or no, I'll never forgive you for voting for him. And then COVID came along and strangely didn't bring out the best in people, it brought out the worst in people. And I honestly don't have a prediction of what the outcome will be 5 years from now.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, I've always felt that sort of the government should stay the heck. Like, you can do whatever you want. Just, keep us safe as a country. That's your primary job. Yeah. All this other, messing in my business and other people's business, get the heck out of there. You don't belong there. We have our rights to be able to, like I said, you want to wear a diaper and go bark at the moon? Go ahead and do it. I could care less. Where it becomes a problem is when you start telling me that I've got to do that or that I've got to accept the way you are. I'll accept you, but if you're a guy dressing up as a woman, I'm sorry.
Hey,
I'm not going to. It's funny when I do podcasts, a lot of times people will say, put your pronouns down. And I usually ignore that.
I always ignore that.
I need your pronouns. I'm like, well, I'm a microwave and a coffee maker. No, well, those aren't pronouns. I'm like, and it's no different than you deciding what your pronouns are. I'm a microwave and a coffee maker. How dare you not say that I am?
I always say to people, one of my favorite questions to say to somebody about anything, if I want to get a good understanding of something, is I ask them to imagine your grandparents. Okay, tell them what pronouns are and make it make sense.
Yeah.
And I've had that conversation, like, if you imagine telling your grandparents what AI is, right?
Yeah.
What the internet is. Everybody can explain it. Right? They can, on some basic level, can say, well, my grandparents were around in the 1870s, and they're like, but I could, and they can tell me how they would explain AI or computers. But when you ask them to explain pronouns, no, it's dead conversation. It doesn't happen because it's like you can't make it make sense. So let's stop pretending.
Exactly. I mean, my pronouns are they, them. Well, I don't know. I took English in school. They, them are plural. There's more than one. So do you have multiple personalities? What,
because it's as ridiculous as, right? You and I were talking, having a conversation, and it wasn't until you mentioned you were 6'8" that I knew you were 6'8". Yeah, I can see you, but on this screen, there is nothing that distinguishes the fact I'm 5'8" and you're 6'8". So I'm the same height as your mum, right? But to everyone else in the world, my head looks bigger than yours, so by definition, I'm bigger than you. Right? And it's just I'm sat closer to a camera than you are. But according to the world, you should know my pronouns. I couldn't even tell you you're 6'8", and 6'8" is fucking huge. That is like a walk-in tree. Do you know what I mean? You can walk into an electric shop and stand above the fridges and freezers.
Yeah.
Right? I can get lost behind 2 washing machines stacked up on top of each other. We're not the same.
You're right.
But there's no way to distinguish that, and yet you can clearly see both of us.
And you know, it's funny. I think back 100 years. My grandparents, my mom's mom and dad, my brother found out this when he was doing our genealogy. My grandparents lived apart for 2 years after they got married because my grandmother was Roman Catholic and my grandfather was Presbyterian, and they could not bring themselves to tell their families that they were in an interfaith marriage. Even though it was Christian, on both sides, they were in an interfaith marriage. So they lived apart for 2 years. And David, that's only 100 years ago. They were married in 1925. It's 2024.
I often refer to myself as being raised as an Irish Catholic because my mum is an Irish Catholic, and her grandparents, my great grandparents, one was a Southern Irish Protestant, and the other one was a Southern Irish Catholic, and my great grandfather was Catholic, and great grandmother was raised as a Protestant in Southern Ireland, right, in the 1800s or whatever it was, and converted to Catholicism so that she get married. Her family never spoke to her again.
Yeah. I mean, think about that. That wasn't that long ago.
It's not. Do you know what I mean? I'm talking about my grandmother's mum and dad.
Yeah.
And but for a few fates, I never met them. But but they didn't sort of die that. My mum knew them, and it's had they just medicine's been better, genes, your DNA being a bit better genetically, she could have lived into her 80s and 90s, and I'd have known her.
Yeah,
it's within my lifetime.
Exactly. Yeah.
And people today get upset because I don't know that they're Z, Xi, or whatever.
I know. I mean, I think the important thing that, if nothing's come out of this discussion, it's that we are all human beings. We are all unique in our own special way. And why can't we just appreciate that in each other?
But that's it. That's exactly it. Because it's incredible, because that's actually one of the things I love about doing this, and one of the things that I think I'm very lucky and blessed to do is because it's just the randomness of conversations that I can have with people, and it just demonstrates that when two people just sit down to have a conversation, we have so much in common, and you can have a great deal. You can, you and I have laughed. We never met before,
right?
And we have this amazing technology that allows us to be in the same room as each other, and just kind of have a conversation. And I just think it's fantastic. But I'm also well aware that while we've been talking, I completely forgot why we were on a podcast together.
Just to connect.
Yeah, do you know? But that's also why I love it. But why? Because I've got former division basketball player, SWAT hostage negotiator, and obviously cancer warrior. But I'm sure that yes. Why was it we were doing this podcast? This is how random and professional I am as a podcast host, by the way. I actually forget why I'm talking to guests because we go off on a random tangent.
Yeah, I mean, your podcast is about having discussions with people from all walks of life, and yeah, I mean, you look at my resume, it kind of looks like a Super Ball went off in a room. It's
Well,
just
because
all over.
I remember writing to you when I asked you to come on as a guest, and there was that line of, this is just describing what you were, and I was just like, that is the best description I've seen. I need to talk to that man.
Yeah,
Because it was almost like
certainly,
a film synopsis.
yeah, exactly. But I'm a human being, just like you are. I have good days, I have bad days. I mean, you talk about I'm 6'8". I am when I stand up,
Yeah.
but because of cancer, I don't have a left leg, and I'm in a wheelchair. So you wouldn't know that from looking at me right
Yeah, of
now.
course, yeah.
But I don't have a left leg, and that's a cancer result. So, yeah, I've lost a lot of you could just walk into a room and people would stop and stare, and you get used to that when you're 6'8". You see over the top of everybody. You see, now I'm looking at everybody's butt. So, I mean, it's just a different perspective.
That must be weird. So I just had this strange memory popped into my head. So in the UK, we have these things that are called kebab vans, and they I don't know if you have kebabs in America, but the closest type of not in terms of what they're serving, but the type of thing, it's a food van, like a taco van, and the big hatch lifts up and everyone stands under it. And I remember having this one guy come to get a kebab, and he was just having a conversation, but he had to duck under the hatch. So you can imagine just how big he probably was, like 6'8", right? Broad guy as well, clearly liked the gym. The nicest guy going, just like, I couldn't describe how just relaxing, funny and calm he was by saying very little. But he was one of the very few people I'd ever had a conversation with when I'm stood in this van looking at them eye to eye. I'm normally peering down even at 6 foot people.
Right.
And I don't remember all of the conversation, but there was this bit of a joke that he's just used to people looking at him. And because he says, I can't go anywhere without being the guy that, is even standing taller than security. So
Yeah.
having grown up like that, did that impact you when you ended up in a wheelchair?
No.
No? I don't
no.
know why that's a question for me, but that's the first thing. It's like, do you know what I mean?
I mean, do I miss, standing up and walking, things like that? Yeah, sure I do. Absolutely.
Look, being 5'7", 5'8" is nothing special. I'm stood up. You're probably still taller than me in a wheelchair. You know what I mean? So
for a lot of people, I am. Yeah. I mean, and my wife and I have a daughter, and unfortunately or fortunately, my daughter got my height and is 6'3", and actually went to college on a basketball scholarship as well. But her husband is your height. Her husband's 5'8", and he was a wrestler, so he's kind of short and squatty. She's tall and thin. Their children will probably be, American football linemen or something like that.
Say,
someday.
If one of them's tall and squatty, there's going to be some damage done.
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean?
So I mean, you are who you are. But our daughter, certainly when she was young and tall, was uncomfortable. I don't like people looking at me when it's like, you know what, you're going to have to get used to it because you can't really do anything about your height. So
one of the things that is really interesting, just talking to you, is you seem to have a remarkable upbeat energy. Did you think is that something trained, or is it just like literally the blessing of the upbringing?
I think it's the blessing of the upbringing. I also think, one of the things we were always taught as hostage negotiators was to be curious.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with somebody, always be curious, use a curious voice, kind of end on the, oh, really? Is that, just kind of end on an upbeat kind of thing. And I've always been curious. I love people. I mean, I read a lot, and usually the books I read are biographies or autobiographies. I want to know what make people tick. I love people. I love hearing their stories. I love being, part of their lives, because, when you're told you're probably going to be dead in 2 years, all of a sudden, I always say so much of my life was spent in the physical. I was a college athlete. I was on the SWAT team. I was in law enforcement, and now I'm in a wheelchair and I don't have a left leg. And I think the way I balance that is, when you can't do what you're good at, You do what's important. And I think I've been doing what's important. And part of that is, I think it's God's way. I have a very strong faith in God. God's way of saying, look, if this guy who's been through hell can be positive and happy and upbeat, the rest of you can be positive and happy and upbeat as well. I think I have a responsibility to kind of say, no matter how bad your life is, there's something positive in it.
You said something there about faith, and do you know, whenever I have, so although I was raised as a Catholic, I have faith, but I don't practice in any way, shape or form religion. But because of that, saying I have faith is a bit of an injustice, because I don't hold something like, and I believe in Jesus Christ and things like that. I'm not kind of disputing him as a person, but it's whenever I talk to people who have strong faith, and I honestly do believe it's if you look at the decline of faith and the rise of all the other problems, that there's a direct correlation, along with other things, but you know. And listening to how upbeat you are, and this idea of service and duty, for want of a better term, you know, like when you can't do what you're good at, do what's important, you know. And this is obviously what's meant for me. I'll put my faith and trust in God's plan. I just, when I hear that, and I mean this respectfully, I'm jealous, because I don't have that in my heart, and I've never had it. Not even as a child who used to go to church, was an altar boy, even at one point as at about 8 or 9, discussed his interest in becoming a priest. You know, I've just never had that God's plan faith, and that's why I say I do mean this respectfully. I'm envious, I'm jealous, because I feel like it's a significant emptiness and a hole in my own being, that I just don't have something. That's because, in a sense, because I'm invested in me as a I suppose, for want of a better term, there's a narcissism in it, and because I don't have something outside of myself that's just like, hey, doesn't matter, whatever happens, it happens, and that's the plan. And but because the weird thing, I'm trying not to kind of overcomplicate it, but one of the reasons I admire it so much is because it doesn't come with laziness and lack of discipline. It comes with discipline. So it's not a, hey, I've got no responsibilities, everything's, whatever happens, happens. It's like, no, whatever happens, happens, but I have a responsibility in this. And it's so kind of inverted in a sense, because it's the opposite of, if you wrote it down in a text, it would sound like, for want of a better term, just some lazy bone-idle hippie who had nothing going in his life and just thinks everything should be free and nobody should work for anything. But it's actually the complete opposite. But it's not my worry. It's not my burden, regardless of what is thrown at me.
I mean, you're right. In a lot of ways, it's not. I mean, I think, again, 2012, you'll be dead in 2 years. Well, I'm still here. I spent 5 years on a drug that eventually became so toxic to my body that I ended up in the intensive care unit of the hospital with a body temperature of 108 degrees, which is usually not compatible with being alive. 108, you're usually dead.
Yeah, exactly.
Somehow, and then I remember when I had my leg amputated, I had these tumors in my lungs, my doctor showed me my CAT scan. And David, I don't know how to read a CAT scan. I have no medical background at all. But I remember, you could kind of look at it, and it was like, oh, well, that sure doesn't look like it belongs there. I have these big tumors in my lungs.
That's how bad it is when the uneducated.
Yeah, exactly. Like, well, okay, I don't know how to read this, but that doesn't look like it belongs there. And I had these big tumors in both lungs. I had fluid all around the pleural spaces. I was, without being gross, I was coughing up green, bloody phlegm. And I remember looking at my doctor and saying, how was I alive? And David, I will never forget this till the day I die. He put his head down, he shook his head no, and then he looked up at me and he said, I don't know, because you shouldn't have been. Mm. I mean, when you have those things occur in your life, you realize I'm not in control of this.
Yeah.
God's using me for a reason, And whenever, when I die, how I die, where I die, way above my pay grade. Don't spend a lot of time worrying about that.
Yeah.
Spend more time. And I think that's what death does.
Yeah.
Death gets you to focus on the living, not the dying. Focus on what's important. Focus on the reason you're here. Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning talks about, don't look at your life in the abstract. Everybody has a reason they are here. You almost have a moral responsibility to find that reason and to live it.
And that's a perfect place to stop. But I have one more random question because I just like asking it. So if you can just imagine that there's some magical formula that you have a time machine, whatever it is, or you're a Harry Potter wizard or whatever, you can go anywhere in history, anytime, any place, any when. Where would you go? Why would you go there? What car would you drive? And what music would you listen to?
Boy, that's a great question. I mean, my perspective in life is certainly based on what I experienced. So I can't tell you, I go back to the 1600s or the 1500s or anything like that. I probably wouldn't. I loved growing up in the 70s.
Yeah.
I loved the music. I loved the way we used to hang out. We'd all get on our bikes and we'd go to somebody's house, and that's how you knew where everybody was, where all the bikes were, and stuff like that. I guess I would go back to the 70s. I would listen to 70s music, and I would drive a 1970 Ford Mustang.
Nice. That and just last
now, whether I'd fit in it or not, that's another story. But that,
hey, we're in the world of magic. You can fit in whatever.
There you go. I love your magic. Yes.
We can make the car bigger or you smaller, whatever you want.
Thank you. Good.
Whatever suit. And just lastly, where can people get hold of you, see you, whatever?
So I have a website / blog called Motivational Check. Every day I put up a thought for the day. And with that thought usually comes a question about how maybe you could apply it in your life. You can certainly leave me a message there. That's at motivationalcheck.com.
I'll make sure that's in the description as well.
Thank you.
It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. I have appreciated it.
Well, I appreciate it, David. It's been great talking with you.
And that's Terry. And I really had a great time talking to him. I loved his energy. I loved our conversation. Please do check out motivationalcheck.com. The website link is in the description. Look him up. Look at his blog. Subscribe. Get your daily dose of Terry's motivation. And I think it's important when you listen to what he said, what he's come through, where he's been. You can only imagine the sort of decisions he had to make. And yet he a vibrant, energetic, life-loving guy. And that's really important. And I'm very grateful to him for coming on. And as always, thank you to everybody that listens, subscribes, shares. All of your support is greatly appreciated. So wherever you are from, whatever you do, whatever you believe, please take care and be blessed. Thank you.